On the morning of August 10th, 1991, in a little rural town in Arizona, two women walked across a parking lot toward a Buddhist temple. They were there to prepare a meal for the monks who lived inside. As they walked, the women noticed that none of the monks were outside meditating or gardening, which was strange. And when they reached the front door, not only was it locked, which was strange, there was also this huge puddle of water forming in front of it, which they just couldn't understand. The women sensed something was off, but they shrugged and left the front door and found an open door on the side of the building and went inside. Minutes later, those women would come running back outside, hysterical, screaming for help. This story includes graphic descriptions of violence. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please make toast at the 5-star review button's house, but scrape all of your excess butter with all the crumbs in it back into their butter container. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the morning of Friday, August 9th, 1991, in a small town in south-central Arizona, a man stepped out of his home and stood quietly on the doorstep, his face turned to the east where the sun was just starting to show above the horizon. Even though he had gotten up early so he could get some gardening in before the real heat of the day set in, now that he was actually outside, he showed absolutely no sign of hurrying. His unlined face and dark eyes were serene as he watched the first rays of light spreading over the desert that bordered one side of the property where he lived and the cotton fields that bordered the other side. Once the sun was up, the man stood with his eyes closed, still as a statue, for several more minutes, taking in the sounds of the world waking up around him. He could hear the hum of insects, along with birds cooing and scratching in the dirt for seeds. He was also aware of the steady rhythm of his own breathing and the movement of a very slight breeze through the branches of the nearby cottonwood trees he had planted 2 years ago. For 36-year-old Buddhist monk Purush Kanthong, these early morning hours that he could spend alone in his garden were often the most peaceful and reflective part of his day. Now, opening his eyes, Purush turned his attention to the narrow path along the side of the single-story white stucco building with the red roof that he and 5 other monks called home. When Purush had first arrived in Arizona from his native Thailand 8 years ago, he had led a small Buddhist community in the state capital of Phoenix. But back in 1985, after the community had scraped together enough money to buy these 5 acres of rural farmland located 20 miles west of Phoenix, Purush had worked tirelessly to collect the money that allowed them to build this modest temple, which was called Wat Pram Kunaram. Since opening its doors 2 years ago, the temple had become an important site of worship for the 1,300 members of Arizona's scattered Thai Buddhist community. And as the abbot of the temple, an abbot is the leader of a monastery, Purush oversaw not only the services, classes, and festivals that the temple offered its worshippers, but he also oversaw the training and education of the 5 monks and 3 novices and temple helpers who currently lived there. Stepping away from the door he had been standing in that led back into the temple's dining room, kitchen, and simple bedrooms, Purush adjusted his bright saffron orange robe and began walking along the narrow path that ran the length of the temple. He listened to the gentle slap of his sandals as he slowly walked past the eggplant, basil, lemongrass, and mint that he had planted alongside the mango, banana, pomegranate, and loquat trees. Coming to a stop near the end of the path, Purush knelt down in front of one of the many little shrines that dotted the garden. As he knelt, he picked up a handful of dry soil and let it run through his fingers. Back in Thailand, August was the wettest month of the year when rice farmers could expect 19 inches of rain. And until his move to Arizona at the age of 28, Purush marked his country's rainy season by staying indoors, so there was no chance that he and his fellow monks might accidentally step on and damage any of the rice seedlings growing in the nearby paddies. But out here in the Arizona desert, things were totally different. Water was scarce, and so it was a very precious commodity. If your property met certain minimum size requirements, you could sign up for a weekly water distribution that was delivered to each property through an irrigation system of pipes and gates. While the temple property was too small to qualify for this water allotment, Parush had worked out an agreement with his neighbor Betty Kraft, whose property also failed on its own to meet the minimum size requirements. But together, their two properties were big enough to sign up for a weekly water distribution, and so they did that, and Parush and Betty shared the water between them. He grinned as he thought of Betty. She loved gardening as much as he did. He'd see her that night, since Friday was the night that the town posted the weekly water distribution schedule. He knew Betty always worried that he might forget to close the headgate on the temple's property, which prevented their shared water allotment from flowing through to the next property along the irrigation line. And so, on whatever day they were scheduled to get their water, Betty almost always called Parush just to make sure that he had adjusted the headgate and opened his hoses so they wouldn't waste or lose even a single drop of their shared water. That was good though. Parush always enjoyed comparing notes with Betty, and he would find out this evening how her fig trees were doing. Maybe that was something he should add next year to the gardens at the temple. Collecting a handful of basil and lemongrass, Parush felt the air growing hotter, and he knew that soon he would hear the sounds of activity inside the monastery as the monks began their morning routine of meditation and work around the temple grounds. As he enjoyed his last few minutes of solitude, Parush was again thankful for the temple's remote location. In Thailand, practically the entire population was Buddhist, but in Arizona, the sight of Thai monks in their bright orange robes with their shaved heads was unusual, and it had drawn a lot of public attention and curiosity at the temple in Phoenix. But here, out in Waddell, the temple's location was so far away from the center of town that many of the town's 1,500 residents didn't even know it existed. And those who did, like Betty, they had come to welcome the sight of the monks in their orange robes quietly going about their business. And so, Parush and the other monks and Thai members of the temple were all basically left alone to meditate and practice their religion. At the core of their religion, Buddhism, is the belief that human life is one of suffering, and the only way to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana, is through meditation, spiritual and physical labor, and good behavior. Buddhists also believe in reincarnation, that you are reborn again and again after death until you reach that final state of enlightenment and you are released from suffering. Buddhist monks play a key role in the religion by living a very simple life that allows them to meditate not only on their own path to enlightenment and acceptance of the present moment, but on enlightenment, peace, and non-violence for all people. By 11 a.m., the temperature outside had reached 101 degrees Fahrenheit, and not even the cottonwood trees could shade Parush from the heat. Soon, it would be time for the monks to eat their single meal of the day. It would be made and served at the temple by a member of the community whose gift of time and food would count as service merits along the path to enlightenment. After lunch, Parush would check in with the temple's newest resident, a 75-year-old nun from Thailand who had moved into the temple just 3 weeks earlier. Visiting her was her 17-year-old grandson and novice monk, an American high school student named Matthew. Parush stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees and robes, and then he turned and walked back down the path to the side entrance of the temple that he had been standing in earlier. Before stepping back inside, he took off his sandals, and he enjoyed the smell of cooking rice wafting out from the kitchen. Once inside, Parush closed the door behind him, and then he stood there quietly for a moment. He let go of all the noise he was hearing both inside and outside of his mind. Then he opened his eyes and stepped into the nearby kitchen, and he left his handful of freshly picked herbs on the counter. At 8:30 a.m. the next day, Saturday, August 10th, Betty Kraft called the temple. At the local well last night, she and Parush had seen that their water distribution was scheduled for that day, the 10th. But that morning, Betty had found out that the distribution was going to start a bit earlier than usual, so she was calling Parush to let him know, and she wanted to remind him, again, to make sure the temple's water headgate was closed. But after dialing the number to the temple, the phone didn't ring, it was just silent. Betty didn't know why this was, and after trying again and still getting nothing, she decided to just hop in her car and make the short drive over to the temple to tell Parush in person. A few minutes later, Betty drove through the open gates of the concrete wall that surrounded the temple's 5-acre lot, and she pulled into the temple's parking area and parked her car. Getting out, she walked over to the side entrance that she knew led into the monks' living quarters. Once there, Betty quickly saw that the temple's hoses were open. Water was running out of them. But it struck her as odd that Perush had not arranged the hoses so that all the water would run into his gardens. Instead, some of the water had started to collect on the little patio right outside the door and was even overflowing into the parking lot down below. Betty felt even more puzzled when she knocked on the side door and didn't get an answer. The same thing happened when she walked around to the front entrance that led directly into the large square temple sanctuary where the monks conducted services. Not only did no one answer either door, but everything inside the building seemed unusually quiet. But not wanting to enter the monk's space without an invitation, and checking once more that the grounds were empty, Betty shrugged her shoulders. At least she knew that the temple's hoses were on and the head gate was closed. So she jumped back into her car and returned to her own property. 2 hours later, at 10:40 a.m., another car drove through the open gates of the temple into the front parking lot. Inside the car were 2 Thai women who were friends and who were both members of the temple. They were there to make the monks' Saturday meal. When the car came to a stop, the 2 women looked around and noticed something strange. There was not a single person outside working in the vegetable gardens or walking on the meditation paths. The women figured there must be a reason for this, so they just got out and headed for the front door of the temple. But before they could reach the door, they had to walk around this large puddle of water that had formed in front of the temple from all of the water pouring out of the open hoses. The women wondered why the hoses had not been adjusted to aim in other directions, but ultimately they ignored the growing puddle, and one of the women reached out and grabbed the front door handle, but when she pulled it, she saw it was locked. This was now the 3rd irregularity that the 2 women had spotted in the span of just a couple of minutes. 51-year-old Chawi Borders and her friend, Primshat Hash, were starting to get a bad feeling about what they were seeing at the temple. Something just felt off. But they quickly reminded themselves that they needed to just focus on what they were doing at the temple, not what the monks might be doing. They were there to make lunch and earn service merits. And besides, the 2 women agreed that the monks must just be inside studying or meditating, and as for the water and locked door, the monks must have just forgotten to turn off the irrigation system and open the front door to the sanctuary. So the 2 women left the front door and headed around to the unlocked side entrance. They took off their shoes outside and then stepped inside. The room they walked into was the dining room. To their left was a door that led to the kitchen. Straight in front of them was that large square temple worship area. And then to their right was a hallway that led down to 5 bedrooms that made up the monks' living quarters. The women turned left and went straight into the kitchen and got to work preparing the monks' lunch. But they hadn't been there for very long before Primshat thought she'd discovered the reason for at least some of the irregularities they had witnessed that morning. As she had walked from the kitchen back toward the side entrance to go back outside and get something from the car, she had glanced quickly down the hallway that led to the monks' 5 bedrooms, and at the front of that hallway, close to where she was a small sitting area with a couple of sofas inside. And in this sitting area, Primshat saw the monks were lying quietly on the floor between these 2 sofas. After getting what she needed from the car, Primshat returned to the kitchen and told her friend, Chawi, that she had just seen the monks in the sitting area and that they were either sleeping or praying. Not wanting to disturb them, the 2 women went about their meal preparation very quietly, and at some point, when Chawi thought she heard the faint ring of a phone, she immediately stepped out of the kitchen into the dining room to answer the phone before the sound could interrupt the monk's concentration or rest. But when she put the phone to her ear, she heard nothing. Thinking she must have picked up the wrong phone, as there was 2 phones in the dining room, she walked across the room to the other phone and put that phone to her ear, but this as well was silent. But as she stood there with this silent phone pressed to her ear, she looked at the first phone she had picked up, and she could tell right away that the cord connecting the receiver to the phone had been cut. Then she pulled the phone in her hand away from her ear, and she saw the same thing. The phone's cord was cut. As she realized that clearly she had not heard a phone ring because now she's seeing neither phone would work, Chawi just happened to glance at the sitting room at the front of the hallway where the monks were lying on the floor in various attitudes of prayer. And almost absently, she noticed that mixed among the colorful saffron robes that the monks wore was the long white shirt and pants worn by the elderly nun who had joined the monastery with her grandson just a few weeks ago. Chawi was suddenly very uneasy. She knew that could not possibly be right. It was absolutely forbidden that a male monk who took strict vows of celibacy would ever lie down next to a woman, let alone lie close enough that their bodies or robes would be touching. As Chawi stood there frozen, her friend Primshot stepped out into the dining room as well and began to let out this terrible wail. Because something else was horribly wrong with what the two women were looking at. There was blood everywhere in the sitting area. There was blood on the floor, on the walls, and on the two sofas. It was 11:09 a.m. that Saturday morning when the emergency call came in to the dispatcher at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department. Chawi and Primshot, who were totally hysterical, had run barefoot to the house of a neighbor who had called 911. By 11:21 a.m., the first law enforcement officer had skidded to a stop in the temple parking lot, and 3 minutes later, 4 more officers had arrived. By 11:45 a.m., the perimeter of the temple grounds had been marked off with yellow crime scene tape, and the parking lot was full of police and medical personnel. And the news had already spread like wildfire through the Buddhist community and among local, state, and national media. It was also making headlines back in Thailand because the temple was now the site of the worst mass murder in Arizona history. Inside that small sitting room, police had found 9 people, every single inhabitant of the temple, including the abbot, Purush, all of them dead. Physical evidence at the scene did not paint a complete picture, but it did allow police to establish a few theories about what happened. There had been at least 2 killers. On the carpet near the victims were 17 .22 caliber casings and 3 spent shotgun shells. A nearby storage room had been sprayed with a fire extinguisher, and in the foam on the floor, police counted 2 different size sets of footprints made by people wearing combat-style boots. These small monastic cubicles where the monks slept had been ransacked and vandalized. The sleeping mats had been pulled off of the wooden bed frames, and what little furniture there was had been broken and knocked to the ground. Police were also able to determine that the killers had found the temple safe, but they had not been able to open it. What puzzled investigators was the fact that the temple's worship area, which was that large square room not far from the sitting area where the bodies had been found, appeared to be untouched, despite the fact that in the worship area, right near the altar, was a visible money tree with at least 20 bills still clipped to the branches. So if this had been a robbery, why didn't the robbers take those bills? Whoever had committed the crime had also left another clue behind. Overlaying the stench of clotting blood, spent ammunition, and human flesh that had already begun to decompose, there was also the smell of something else that was completely out of place in a Buddhist monastery, the stale but strong scent of cigarette smoke. Even as the first responders to the crime scene went about their grisly work of photographing the dead and collecting evidence, the sheriff of Maricopa County, 55-year-old Tom Agnos, knew his department was in way over its head trying to deal with a mass murder. So he immediately began the process of pulling together a multi-agency task force to help investigate the crime, process the crime scene, and collect and analyze any forensic evidence. But before the police could even write up their preliminary crime scene report, and just hours after the bodies had been discovered, along with the media, hundreds of members of the Asian community in and around Phoenix were gathering outside the temple wall. In the 101-degree Fahrenheit heat, reporters had already begun to broadcast and air interviews, putting forward wildly different and competing theories about possible motives for the killings. Some reports speculated that the murders were a robbery or a hate crime directed at the Asian and Buddhist communities. Others speculated that the killings were gang-related or drug-related, that maybe the temple itself or some of the monks or temple residents had direct connections to the growing trade in heroin coming out of Thailand into the United States. Meanwhile, based on their discussions with Betty Kraft, who had met with Purush at the local well in Waddell at 9:30 p.m. on the night of August 9th, along with findings from the medical examiner's office, the investigators were able to narrow down the time of the murders to between 2 and 4 a.m. on the morning of August 10th. But despite all the evidence of violence and destruction left at the crime scene, by August 12th, 2 days after the mass murder, the best lead that investigators had was just a report of a red SUV, a Ford Bronco with a white stripe, that had been seen by several different witnesses driving away from the area where the temple was located around the time that the murders were likely to have been committed. Over the next few weeks, more than 60 law enforcement personnel would follow up on more than 500 leads, including that report of the red Ford Bronco, but none of those leads would pan out. Officers dug into the private lives of the 9 victims, but they just could not come up with any person or group who might have wanted one of them or all of them dead. Members of the Asian community had raised a $10,000 reward for information leading to the killers, but no one had come forward with anything useful. But almost exactly 1 month after the murders, the task force would receive what they believed was their first real break in the case. On Monday, September 10th, police in Tucson, Arizona, called the Special Task Force headquarters in Phoenix, saying they had just gotten a tip related to the mass murder. The tip had come in that morning from a 24-year-old patient at the Tucson Psychiatric Institute who had checked himself into the facility after attempting suicide. The patient, who gave police several false names before giving them his real name, Michael Lawrence McGraw, was known in his hometown neighborhood of South Tucson by yet another name, Crazy Mike. He told Tucson police that he had something to say about, quote, some kind of murders that happened in Phoenix at the Buddhist temple. As soon as they got this tip, investigators drove to Tucson and went through the administrative process of getting Mike released from the psychiatric hospital so they could drive him back to Phoenix for questioning. Once that was done and Crazy Mike was in Phoenix, investigators at the task force headquarters spent the next 3 days questioning him during interrogations that sometimes lasted longer than 12 hours at a stretch. Between sessions, Mike was taken to a 4-star Sheraton hotel and treated to room service, but he was never allowed to sleep for more than a few hours at a stretch, and he did not have a lawyer with him for the interrogations. Eventually, Crazy Mike confessed to the temple murders, although audio recordings of the interrogation showed that Mike needed and got a lot of help from his interrogators before he actually got the details of the crime straight. On September 13th, 3 days after Mike had been brought in for questioning, police had arrested 4 other men from Tucson that Mike had said were also involved in the killings. All 4 of the accused were acquaintances of Mike, and all 4 were subjected to the same interrogation techniques that detectives had employed when they had questioned Mike. And 3 of the 4 men confessed to the murders and were immediately charged with multiple homicides. The 4th man had a solid alibi and just refused to yield to what the courts would later describe as questionable interrogation techniques by the task force. But by late September, the case against the so-called Tucson 4, which was Crazy Mike and the 3 other men who confessed, quickly fell apart. Each of the suspects recanted their confessions, saying they were, quote, coerced by investigators who frightened them, gave them details about the case, and told them that their friends had already implicated them in the crime, end quote. Not only were investigators back to square one, but the botched interrogations of the Tucson 4 had resulted in public outcry and criticism of the police and caused divisions inside of the task force, which now numbered more than 200 people. The real first break in the Waddell Temple massacre would not come until October 24th, 6 weeks after the killings. And that break was actually based on a lead that the police had gotten 1 month earlier on September 21st and had just failed to follow up on. It would turn out that on the same day that Crazy Mike phoned the Tucson Police Department on September 21st, saying he had information about the murders, investigators for the Special Task Force had also received a tip from the Office of Special Investigations at the Luke Air Force Base. Luke Air Force Base is located about 6 miles east of the Waddell Temple. The Office of Special Investigations, which is the name of the military police unit that provides law enforcement on the base, had notified the task force that they had picked up a weapon from someone driving on base, and the weapon matched the description of the one used in the Temple massacre. But in all the excitement of getting the phone tip from Crazy Mike at the psychiatric hospital and having a real live suspect to interrogate, task force detectives did not send this weapon in for testing. Instead, after picking the weapon up from Luke Air Force Base, one of the sergeants on the task force literally put the weapon behind a door in a corner of his office, and then he forgot about it until 4 weeks later when the case against the Tucson Four started to implode. At that point, with the task force scrambling for new leads, the sergeant remembered the weapon and they would send it off for testing at the Arizona State Crime Lab. The results of that test came back 4 days later on October 24th, and 2 days after that, on October 26th, investigators arrested 2 people in connection with the mass murder. And the story that these 2 people would tell police left even the most hardened detectives feeling shocked and repulsed. Based on the testimony of these 2 individuals, here is a reconstruction of what really happened in the early morning hours of Saturday, August 10th, inside the Waddell Temple. The last communication between the residents of the Waddell Temple and the outside world happened at about 11 p.m. on the night of Friday, August 9th. Perush, the abbot of the temple, had already come back from his meeting at the local well with neighbor Betty Kraft. Other monks had also returned to the temple after performing a blessing ceremony at the house of one of the temple members earlier that evening. At 11, one of the monks telephoned the woman who had prepared that day's noontime meal, asking if she would like to return to the temple the next day, Saturday, an offer she later told police she had declined. After 11 p.m., finished with their daily routine of meditation, prayer, work, and teaching, 4 of the temple's residents made their way to the small sitting room to talk and watch TV. The temple's gentle 75-year-old nun, who had spent most of her life in Thailand doing the back-breaking work of planting and harvesting rice, had made her way to her tiny sleeping quarters, less a bedroom than a closet, that had just enough space inside for a simple sleeping mat, but which gave her the required physical separation from the monks. But just as the evening was coming to a close for the residents of the temple, the night was just getting started for 2 local teenage boys, one 16 years old and one 17 years old. This was a night, in fact, that had been a long time in the making. 3 months earlier, one of the teens' brothers had told them that the Waddell Temple was full of riches like golden Buddha statues and a safe full of money. And this brother would know because he had actually spent 6 weeks that summer living in the temple as a novice monk. And so the 16-year-old and the 17-year-old became obsessed with this temple and these riches. But as they thought more and more about robbing the temple, they realized they weren't just interested in the money. They were also interested in treating this robbery like it was a full-scale military operation. And they both agreed that for this military operation to be successful, they would have to pull it off without leaving any witnesses. So back in June of 1991, while Perush and his fellow monks were out in the temple gardens just starting to plant melons, basil, corn, and sweet potatoes, the 2 teens started preparing for their robbery/war game. Both of the boys had fathers who worked at the nearby Luke Air Force Base, so the boys went to the base store and over a period of time bought the gear they needed. Boots, camouflage hats, scarves, military belts and goggles, battle harnesses, and military knives and flashlights. Getting the weapons wasn't hard either. The 16-year-old boy had access to his father's 20-gauge pump-action shotgun that he loaded up with birdshot. When you fire birdshot, it's like firing a cluster of small metal BBs all at once. And the 17-year-old would borrow a .22 caliber rifle from an unsuspecting acquaintance. By late summer, after weeks of talk and planning, the 2 teen boys had settled on a date. They'd arrive at the temple late on the night of Friday, August 9th, when they knew all the monks would be inside the temple. So just before midnight on that Friday night, the 2 boys, dressed in their full military outfits and driving an older model Mustang, turned off the car headlights as they rolled through the open gates of the temple and parked the car in the far corner of the parking lot. The boys pulled on their gloves and then checked to make sure their guns were loaded and that all the gear they would need was either hooked onto their bodies or in their respective duffel bags. Then, after nodding to one another, they put their big goggles over their eyes, pulled their hats down tight over their foreheads, and pulled their scarves up around their nose and mouths. Then they got out of the car and began walking toward the side door of the temple that led into the dining room. Just after midnight on August 10th, the quiet inside the temple was suddenly shattered. The 4 monks in the sitting area heard a bang as the side door was suddenly flung open, and a moment later, 2 people dressed in military gear were dragging them out of their seats. The air was filled with shouts, "Hit the dirt, down on the floor, now, now, now!" As the monks stumbled first to their feet and then to their knees, they stared in shock at these intruders who seemed to have just come out of nowhere. It was impossible to see the boys' faces, but the monks saw that one of the attackers was over 6 feet tall and must have weighed over 200 pounds. Up close, both of the boys smelled like beer, cigarettes, and sweat. But the monks hardly had time to process any of this before the intruders split up, one of them screaming and waving a long-barreled gun as he circled the 4 monks who were now kneeling on the floor in the 6-foot-wide space between the 2-person and 6-person sofas on opposite sides of the sitting area. Meanwhile, the other intruder ran down that narrow hallway leading to the temple's 5 bedrooms, where he dragged the remaining 2 monks, 1 novice monk, and the temple helper back to the sitting room, where they also were forced at gunpoint to join the circle of monks in the cramped space between the sofas. It was obvious after one look in the monks' bare, empty bedrooms that this temple was not full of riches like the boys had hoped. But that didn't stop the 2 boys from taking turns vandalizing, smashing, and destroying everything in front of them. And when one of the boys pulled open the door of the final room at the end of the hallway, which was really just a large closet, cowering on her knees right in front of him was the temple's oldest resident, the tiny 75-year-old nun and grandmother who had only arrived at the temple 3 weeks earlier with her 17-year-old grandson. Grabbing hold of her white shirt dress, the intruder dragged her back to the sitting area and then forced her to take her place amongst the others. After an hour spent ransacking the living quarters and temple office, the only treasure the 2 boys had found was a safe that they could not figure out how to open, and some envelopes of cash offerings from members of the temple. So, frustrated, the 2 boys would spend their second hour in the temple switching back and forth between terrorism and more destruction. Taking turns, they circled their kneeling captives, stepping on their legs and backs, prodding them with the barrels of the rifle and the shotgun, and jumping on and off the seats of the sofa as they made their way around and around, demanding the combination to the safe and the location of any hidden valuables they were sure the monks must have somewhere. And as they tortured and degraded the 9 people in front of them, the boys smoked one cigarette after another, blowing the smoke into their captives' faces and crushing out the butt of each cigarette in a big glass ashtray that they had placed in the center of their human circle. But from the very first moment that the boys had broken into the temple, the response from the monks totally threw them off. These were not people who wanted to fight or argue or beg or even resist. Instead, the more violent and threatening the boys became, the less of a reaction they got from their victims. Instead, the monks looked around the circle and calmly made faces of encouragement at the terrified novice monk and the temple helper, who just went by the simple name of Boy, and the 75-year-old nun. At some point, Purush laced his fingers together in prayer and began to chant. The other 5 monks, who, like him, had spent years learning to accept, without question or resistance, every moment and circumstance in their lives, joined him. In Buddhism, one of the greatest meditations of all is the meditation on the inevitability of death. And as Purush looked from face to face around the circle, he wanted each one of them to know that however and whenever death came, it would bring the gift of rebirth and enlightenment. So even as the intruders physically and verbally assaulted them, trying to get them to not only give up the code to the safe, but to react to their captors with fear, Purush and the other monks just continued to mentally withdraw into the calm space of their meditation and prayer. And their strength appeared to give the other non-monks the resolve they needed to relax and be calm as well. And before long, the 17-year-old novice monk, the temple worker they called Boy, and the 75-year-old nun had all bowed their heads as well and closed their eyes. And so by the time the bigger of the 2 boys finally lifted the barrel of his shotgun and fired 4 rounds into the circle of kneeling figures, blowing off kneecaps and fingers and sending birdshot into the soft skin of necks and faces, his victims had already left the world of flesh and blood behind. As the victims silently absorbed the blasts from the shotgun, The second intruder walked up behind one of the victims, he raised his rifle, and he fired 2 shots into the back of their head. As the victim slumped forward with their hands still laced together in front of their chest in prayer, the other 8 victims didn't make a sound. They just continued to pray and meditate, knowing they were next. For the next several minutes, the second attacker slowly made his way around the circle, systematically putting at least 2 rounds into the back of each of the victims' skulls. After making sure that all 9 people inside the temple were dead, the 2 intruders packed up the money and personal items they had stolen from the temple and headed back out the side door. They ran back to their car, pulling the scarves down from their sweat-soaked faces, and began gulping in the hot, dry, and clean desert air. And then they drove out through the open gates of the Buddhist temple and back into their everyday normal lives. Except that 12 days later, on August 21st, military police on Luke Air Force Base found a .22 caliber rifle in the trunk of a car they had pulled over for suspicious activity. The rifle belonged to the driver, who had just recently loaned the weapon to the passenger with him in the car, a 17-year-old teenager named Jonathan Duty. It wasn't until 1 month later, September 20th, that the police report describing the traffic stop and the weapon would find its way to the task force investigating the mass murder, and it would be 4 weeks after that before members of the task force would finally get around to having that weapon tested and find that it was the murder weapon used in the Temple massacre. Once those results came back in, it would take 2 days for task force investigators to track the rifle back to 17-year-old Jonathan Duty and to his accomplice, a 16-year-old named Alex Garcia, who was 6 foot 3 inches tall and who weighed 220 pounds. Alex was the first to confess to the murders, saying that Jonathan was both the mastermind of the robbery and the one who walked around the ring of victims and shot them all in the head, execution style. It was also Jonathan Duty's half-brother, who had spent time as a novice monk living in the temple that summer, who had said there were riches inside of the temple. When the boys were asked why they committed this horrible crime, Jonathan told police he just wanted to get money to buy a car, and Alex told police he wanted, quote, walk-around money that would impress the girls. As for why they had killed everyone, they said they were just following their plan to not leave any witnesses behind. Although, despite claiming to have this well-thought-out military-style robbery all planned out going into the temple, it was fairly obvious that once the boys actually got inside, violence and destruction became the focus, not the robbery. This is likely why the boys did not take that money that was just sitting in plain sight near the altar in the worship room. At the end of the attack, Jonathan and Alex had left the temple with just under $2,800, 2 stereos, 6 cheap cameras, a low-end video recorder, a pair of binoculars, and a handheld bullhorn. In addition to their confessions, forensic analysis of the shoe prints and the saliva left on the cigarette butts found at the temple also conclusively linked the boys to the killing and the crime scene. After 3 different trials, both teenagers were finally convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The Tucson 4, who were falsely accused and arrested for the murders, were released from jail on November 2nd after Jonathan and Alex said that no one aside from themselves was involved in the temple murders and robbery. In 1994, Maricopa County paid the Tucson 4 $2.8 million in damages for false arrests and defamation. Within weeks of the mass murders, the Waddell Temple reopened under the leadership of Abbot Winai Booncham, a Thai monk who had been longtime friends with Purush. Booncham said that after he had taken his friend's body back to Thailand to be cremated, Purush started appearing to Booncham in his dreams. And even though the temple did not reopen as a living and study space for monks until after serious security measures were put in place, Booncham moved into the temple immediately after the murders. When asked why he did that, Booncham said that he saw his friend, Purush, everywhere in the temple, and so he was not afraid. In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail, so it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods, and even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can, and as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her, and she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization, or she could take a shortcut. Because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road, but she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent. She zips it up and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn. She doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside. And as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low, audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off and they say, look, we can't find her. Two days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then, after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break and she effectively made this whole situation up. That she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. Our next story is called The Dream. On March 7th, 1975, 21-year-old Mark Hansen, along with two of his friends from college, Ben Fish and John Chidester, arrived at a parking lot on the eastern side of the Appalachian Trail. All three of the young men were in incredible physical shape and were excited to spend their spring break challenging themselves on some of the trail's most rigorous hikes. The day before they were supposed to go, they almost canceled the trip because there was this terrible weather system that was coming over the trail. And they were thinking, it's going to be dangerous. It's not such a good idea. And then they started talking some more and they were like, well, we're already going to, challenge ourselves. It would be even more challenging to hike these really difficult trails with the inclusion of bad weather. So this is another way to, test our abilities. And so they kind of got pumped up at the idea of hiking the Appalachian Trail in terrible weather. So the guys arrive in the parking lot, the windshield wipers are furiously working to keep the pouring rain off. They hop out and they're getting soaked by the rain. They put on their ponchos, they grab their heavy packs, and they make their way over to the trail. Their plan was to move west along the trail until they hit the Tri-Corner Shelter, where they would spend their first night. The Tri-Corner Shelter is one of the many shelters along the Appalachian Trail. They are open to the public. There's no heating or electricity, but it provides shelter from the storm. You can go in there and, get in a sleeping bag and you'll be fine. But to get to the Tri-Corner Shelter, they would need to hike 16 miles, almost completely uphill, walking right into the wind, and it's raining on them, and it's supposed to snow later on, so it's just a treacherous first day. But they take off, they start walking up this trail, and after a couple of miles, John says, you know what, guys? This is awful. I think we should probably turn around. I think we've underestimated how bad this is going to be. Let's go back to the car and we'll do this another time. But Mark and Ben were like, oh no, we are committed. We are doing this. We are not turning around. And John's like, you know what? Suit yourself. I'm not going to do that. And he turned around and he left and he went back to the car and he would pick them up when they were done. After John turned around, Mark and Ben, they felt good. They felt tough. They're going to stick this hike out. And so they take off again and Ben's in the lead. And Ben seems to be handling the poor weather and difficult hike and heavy pack a lot better than Mark is. In fact, over the next several hours, Mark would drift farther and farther back and Ben would need to wait for him and Mark would be hunched over, really just struggling with this hike. And then at some point, Mark yells to him and says, I gotta take my pack off. I can't carry this much weight up this hill until we get to the shelter. I'm not gonna make it to the shelter. And Ben would say to him, if we don't get to the shelter for some reason, you're going to be stranded out here in this storm without any warm clothes, without your sleeping bag, without your tent, without your food, without your water. It's way too dangerous. You have to keep your pack on. And so finally Mark is convinced and he's like, oh, all right, puts his pack back on and they continue moving. About an hour later at 7 p.m., they had reached the section of the trail where they knew they were getting close-ish to the Tri-Corner Shelter. They were certainly well beyond the halfway point. But it was dark out, the temperature had dropped significantly. At this point, Ben is basically Mark's cheerleader, kind of egging him on to keep moving, and Mark's kind of staggering along this trail, and Ben and Mark are just hoping that shelter just appears at some point here because they don't know how much farther they can go. Another hour and a half goes by. They still haven't made it to the shelter. Mark is groaning. He can barely move. It's pitch black. The rain has now completely shifted over to snow, and it is just dumping snow on them. And Ben is concerned that, somehow did we take a wrong turn, even though they were on a really well-marked trail, and he knew they hadn't. He figured they must be so close at this point. And it was around this time that Mark yells out to Ben, "I'm done. I can't go any farther." And he sits down right in the middle of the trail. He's sitting down with his pack, and he's just laying there, and Ben is like, "Come on, we're so close. You can't sit down now." And Mark's like, "I'm not moving. I can't do any more. I'm going to sleep right here." Ben knows this is a bad idea. I mean, they did have warm clothes and sleeping bags, and they probably would be just fine sleeping out in the middle of the trail, but it just seemed so unnecessarily risky when there's probably a shelter maybe a couple 100 meters away, and he would turn out to be right. And so he decides he's going to walk ahead on the trail, and he's going to see if the shelter's there, but he only went about 100 meters. He was within maybe 100 meters of the actual shelter, but he never saw it. And so after going ahead and feeling like, man, I don't want to drag Mark any farther, if there's no shelter ahead, for all we know, we took a wrong turn. And so he turns back around and he goes back near Mark, not next to him, but close enough to him that he can see him. And he sits down on the trail too. He gets his sleeping bag out, he crawls inside, and he falls asleep. That night, Ben would have this vivid, horrible nightmare where he heard Mark screaming for help, yelling for Ben to come save him as he's being dragged off the trail into the forest. And it scared him so much that Ben woke up and he looks down the trail to where Mark is, and he can see Mark's backpack is sitting right on the trail. And so he thinks, oh, Mark's still there. And he's so tired, he's not about to get up and go check. He's like, that was just a dream. And he goes back to sleep. The next morning, when the sun comes up, Ben gets up again, and the first thing he does is he looks over at Mark, and he sees the pack, but he realizes that Mark is not there. It's just the backpack. And so Ben jumps up and he yells for Mark. He doesn't get a response. He's looking around thinking he's got to be around here, but he's not. It snowed that night, so any tracks Mark would have left to show where he went to were now covered up. And that's when it dawns on Ben that that dream he had the night before, that might have been real. And he has this sinking feeling that something horrible has happened to Mark and that he didn't save him. And so he thinks, I gotta get authorities. He grabs his bag. He leaves Mark's there because he's thinking maybe he'll come back and he'll grab it. And Ben turns and runs down the trail in the direction he hopes is towards this tri-corner shelter. And he can't believe it when literally 200 meters away, he finds the tri-corner shelter. They were that close. And inside are other hikers. He was able to get one of them to run down and get Park Services to know that they have a missing hiker on the trail. Searchers were dispatched to the area where Mark and Ben had been sleeping on the trail. The first thing they did is they went to his bag, and inside were all the things he would need to survive out in the wild. His tent, his warm clothes, his sleeping bag, his food, his water, everything. It was all left there. Over the next few days, hundreds of searchers combed the area. They had helicopters overhead, and they made no significant discovery. However, one park ranger discovered this huge cave that was not that far away from where they had been sleeping. And inside of this cave, this ranger said a large mammal had been staying recently. It was not there now. And there was all these animal bones inside the cave. So it was obviously a predator of some kind. And so there was speculation that between this cave that probably held, a bear or something like that, and Ben's dream that probably was reality of Mark being pulled off the trail screaming for help, that maybe Mark was attacked by some animal that dragged him away. On the 9th day of the search, Mark's body was found. It was located 3 miles down the hill from where he and Ben had been sleeping up on that trail. Mark was positioned up against a tree. His jacket was open, his gloves were off, and his boots were off, and they were placed right next to him. An autopsy concluded he must have died within 24 to 36 hours of leaving that trail. So there's lots of questions with this one, namely, why did Mark, in the middle of the night, get up, not tell Ben where he was going, and then leave the trail and walk 3 miles away? The trail they were on was very well worn, that even at night in a snowstorm, it would be very obvious if you were on the trail or if you were off the trail. So Mark had to have known he was leaving the trail. But even if Mark had a great reason for wanting to leave the trail, just hours earlier he couldn't even stand. That's why they were even laying on the trail to begin with, because he couldn't go any farther. So the idea that he can just jump up in the middle of the night and navigate this really difficult terrain for 3 miles in total darkness in the snow, that doesn't make sense either. And then you have Ben's dream, where he hears Mark screaming for help, and he's yelling for Ben to come save him as he's getting dragged off the trail. There's a good chance what Ben was hearing and seeing in his dream was actually playing out just several feet away from him down the trail. The next and final story of today's episode is called Big Footprint. In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada, for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking, we're gonna find her. They go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back. And there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking. And so they call the police. The police show up and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, Her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the third day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they had thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves, that's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belonged to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed. And two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, How did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballen podcast, and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr.